My name is Dan Sonneson. I'm the director of the Language Center for the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the first installment of what we hope will be a long and fruitful series of shared events hosted by what we are calling the Language Collaboratory. The Language Collaboratory is a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue on the teaching of languages and cultures, driven by language centers and institutes at the University of Iowa, University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, Michigan State University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The purpose of this initiative is to provide collaborative professional development opportunities for educators of language, culture, and literature at the 5 institutions. We kick off this collaboration with a set of 10 weekly conversations that address particular needs for language educators in this unprecedented time of online and remote teaching and learning. This series addresses perennial issues of accessibility, inclusivity, and learner autonomy and agency through the lens of our current shared circumstances, and approaches these issues from a variety of perspectives, building on the expertise of individuals on our own campuses. Each of the 5 institutions will host 2 30-minute sessions. In this series, we aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging the institutional distance and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. Attendees are invited to contribute to what we hope will be lively discussions. The sessions will be recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you keep your microphone muted at the outset and that you use tools in Zoom to contribute questions and comments in the chat. During the open discussion, please raise your hand virtually prior to activating your microphone. Closed captioning is available through the live transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. Today's host is Michigan State University, and I turn the floor over now to Felix Cronenberg, Director of the Center for Language Teaching Advancement at Michigan State University. Felix.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Yeah, I'm extremely excited that we're starting this. We've talked about this for a number of years now. And it took a pandemic for us to actually take that plunge, and we're doing it, and it's exciting to actually see this happening. And I really hope that this will be a really exciting opportunity for all of us to get to know each other and to collaborate more and be less on our campuses and silos and share and have conversations. And so I'm really excited to have with me today Caitlin Cornell, who is our new Assistant Director in CELTA, in the Center for Language Teaching Advancement, and she started this summer. Caitlin is also in her last year of her Second Language Studies PhD program, so soon we can call her Dr. Cornell, and we're very excited about that. So she's a very busy person, and we just recently talked about it, so we'll frame this as a conversation. This is new for all of us, so we'll see where the format takes us. So we're kind of the vanguard here, basically. But we had a conversation about this yesterday and talked already about this. And one thing that was really struck with me was a story about Kahoot. You may know Kahoot. It's a technology you can use in the classroom. I don't know if you can even use it, probably not outside. I don't know how you would do that, but and how that technology that's really transformative and innovative can also be very inaccessible. Caitlin, can you tell me why, or can you retell the story for everyone?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me, everybody. So this story is one that I love, even though it points out one of my personal failures in the classroom. This actually happened to me several years ago now, probably at least 6 or 7 years ago, when I was teaching English in Chicago. And actually knowing that I had a visually impaired language learner in my class didn't somehow sway me from still thinking that Kahoot, in the way that I traditionally used it, was going to be a good idea for this student. So because not assuming that everybody knows what you're talking about is sort of another layer of accessibility, I'll very briefly describe Kahoot so that everybody kind of knows how it works, or how I was at least using it in that time. Essentially, you can go into the program and create, we'll call it a quiz. I think you can use it a few different ways, but I was certainly making a quiz. And part of the quiz ends up being projected on the wall in a classroom using it, you know, an LCD projector and a screen. And then there's another component where students' cell phones are used. But what's interesting is Kahoot separates the information that you've input into a quiz so that students only see certain elements on the screen and certain other elements on their phone. So what was happening is that this particular student didn't have access to the input on the screen because it wasn't close enough to him. On his personal phone, it was fine because he had magnifying software that he regularly used in the classroom and this kind of thing. So I felt like an utter failure to that student in that moment, in that classroom situation. And it really got me thinking about, wow, this, you know, at the time, Kahoot was really big in conferences, professional development situations. Everybody was learning about Kahoot at the time. So I kind of took this technological best practice, applied it to the classroom, and it utterly, it let this guy fall through the cracks in my classroom. So of course, in the moment, I gave that sort of ad hoc accommodation of reading aloud to him from the screen so that at least I could try to construct some participation from him. But I realized that this student did not have equitable access to the interaction and the moment that we were sharing as a class in this activity. And that really, really bothered me and sat with me for a long time. So often when I work in accessibility, I think about what we're taught to do by research, because we've learned about it from colleagues, because it has worked for us before, and how some of those things are inherently ableist and putting up roadblocks for some of these students that we have in our classes.
Yeah, and everyone feel free to post your questions in the chat already as they happen. So Caitlin, what are some ways then? What are some accessible, inclusive, flexible ways to use common media, to use different tools like that? Like one thing it seems to be is giving choices, right? Are there other ways, or how do you give meaningful choices?
That's a great follow-up question. I think meaningful choices is probably one of the first ways that I would direct people to kind of tweak what they've been doing already in the classroom. What I did end up doing in the Kahoot situation, the next time I ran it with that particular class, what I decided is that I would set up pairs that would work together. And in each pair, there was always someone who wasn't seeing the screen. So at least in that case, that student was not the only person interacting with the technology in the same way as other students in the class. So again, it may not have been perfect, but it was a way for me to circumvent the sort of inequitable, I would call it, participation that he was definitely othered by him having to participate in the activity in a certain way compared to everybody else. So it kind of took care of that element. I do really like involving choice and alternative though, whenever possible. And there are a few ways you can do that. You can do it explicitly in your course design by offering, I've done this before where I have kind of I'm gonna call it a universal rubric. So maybe students would have a critical reflection to write and there's a rubric that hits all the elements I wanna see, but how they give that to me is completely open-ended. It can be an essay, it can be a video, it could be, as long as they help me interpret it well enough, because I'm not particularly creative, they could do an art piece. I try to incorporate choice and alternatives wherever possible. And even when I'm not good at doing it, sometimes students come to me with ideas too.
Thank you. Yeah. So one thing, of course, is there are disabilities that we know about, and then there are, of course, those that we don't know about. And to me, and I'm not an expert as you are on this, but for me, there are certain things that come to mind immediately that we think and we see in the chat. If students are blind, if they're hard of hearing, so those are some things that often come up. I'm sure there are many others, and we don't have the time to go through all of them. But for me, one thing that always comes up is listening, because it's such an integrated part to what we do, right? In languages, especially in communicative teaching. And so students that are hard of hearing, that's often part of a learning outcome. Is there a way to rework that? Because, if that is the learning outcome and you can't assess it in that way, that makes it extremely difficult from the beginning on.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think even I am perhaps not enough of an expert to be able to talk about all of the discourse and research that we have kind of around this idea. But I hear rumblings that, personally, I think that we should always take a look at our learning outcomes and make sure that we aren't expecting our students to do something in the L2 that they would not be doing authentically in their home language as well. In the case of a hard of hearing learner, for example. Sometimes that's not, I don't want to say possible, but maybe not feasible, because there are assessment structures that are set up to meet those learning outcomes, and there are programmatic wide decisions that are made. So it can be very hard on a one instructor basis to make some of those meaningful changes. But what we can do, for example, if there is a listening outcome that requires some listening assessment of a learner who's hard of hearing, we can, in privacy appropriate ways, maybe find out what that learner is able to do in the home language, maybe just by observing in the classroom, so sort of what happens. But when it comes to assessment, for example, we might consider, depending on what we know of the needs of our student, we might consider making sure that that listening assessment is a video clip where they can read lips and not just a plain audio clip. So there are ways, even if we can't really go back and totally revisit the outcome itself, there are ways of making sure that we're making the path toward that outcome sort of as equitable as possible and as fair, given what a learner is able to do in their home language.
Yeah. So another thing that comes to mind is with listening, you know, I teach a media course, so I have a lot of videos, and of course there's ways of putting on closed captioning. So now also when we use Zoom, we always use closed captioning, which in a foreign language is not that easy to do. As maybe in English it's easier, right? Because it can be automated to some extent, but in terms of adding captions to videos, whether they're commercial videos and you just use subtitles, there's of course then the choice which language. You got 2 languages there. Could you speak a little to that?
A little, yeah. It would be a bit easier if we had a syllabus maybe in front of us, and we were looking at, you know, specific needs of a course. But yeah, I think that, again, there are probably ways that we can rethink that. I think that we can think about, well, this particular practice element can be in any language really, because the goals of the activity are not necessarily to look at the nitty-gritty sort of even word level elements of whatever might be in those captions in the L2. And maybe it's better because we're having some sort of global discourse, we can use the home language instead, for example. I think we also need to remember that even though I think language instructors have this idea that anytime we involve captions, it makes something a reading activity rather than a listening based activity. We need, I think, to embrace the idea that sometimes that still might be okay. It might not be as close to an assessment as we're going to get. It might not be this or that, but it also, and I tend to not love this argument that we often see with universal design for learning, but one of the big arguments for designing as wide as possible for needs that we might not even know about yet. A lot of people say, well, it's good for everybody. And it's true, it is. I love captions, and I do not have any kind of hard of hearing or other reason why I might like captions specifically. Everybody likes them, especially now. I never listen to videos on my phone without captions anymore, this kind of thing. I think there are a lot of reasons that we might want to do that, and it might even be a more authentic activity sometimes for our students if we embrace the fact that sometimes it's okay to put captions in one language or the other, again, depending on the course goals and the assessment goal involved.
And so what about spontaneous speech? So there are some things, of course, that are, you know, you can plan for a video, you can maybe put captions on, and even being in Zoom now, recording is easier now than in the live classroom, but in the live classroom, spontaneous speech, and I'm thinking too of, you know, noise levels and where people sit and group work and kind of interference. What about those things? What can we do there?
Again, I think sort of embracing the idea that it's okay to do some of those things as long as maybe it's not all the time with every activity, and understanding that MSU, for example, has identified that the largest population of disabled learners, undergraduate learners, I believe, fall into the category of psychological disabilities, which includes the big one of anxiety. I even get anxious when I speak a foreign language of any kind, even the one I speak the best. And so I think that we like to involve as much of that spontaneous speaking practice as possible in courses. And, you know, the researcher in me understands exactly why we do that. I went on study abroad for a reason. I know what I got out of it, right? But I think that balancing that with a lot of empathy for, particularly in 2020, what a lot of students might be going through, is really the key piece there. So I don't think it's that we don't use it, but I think it's we consider what we might know about particular students' needs and make sure that we build in some times where there's some kind of warning. Hey, it's Tuesday, we're going to do that speech activity that some of you hate, you know, that kind of thing. You can still build in a little bit of structure and forewarning in ways that might make things more comfortable. Routine is one of those things that helps a lot in a really chaotic time like a pandemic like this. And online instructors know a lot about how routine can be very helpful in that format as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, yeah. So changing, one question was actually about blind students, and one thing that I often, in our learning management system prompts me often, which is good now, we get this plugin, I think, that prompts me, put in an alternative text for images. And I said, you know, I love teaching with images. They're so rich, they're so great for language learning. And so, you know, I'm glad I'm prompted and I put that in, but then again, the question is there, what do I put in terms of, you know, do I put this in the L1 or the L2? How much do I put in there? Can you say that? Because that seems to be one of those things that, especially now that most things are virtual, I think we spend even more time kind of in the digital realm and putting alternative text there.
Yeah. So without saying that I'm an alt text expert, there are kind of two answers to your question. The first one might be how much alt text taking out the language element. Just pick one language, how much is too much? I'm not even sure that I've achieved the appropriate balance, but you want enough detail that someone can get an idea of what's in the image, the same that a sort of typically sighted person might be able to get from their first glance at that image. So there's that balance. And then on top of that, I think that I would advise that we put the alt text in the home language when at least the home language is shared by most of the students in the class. And here's why. If you can imagine with me for a minute, that sort of very common vocabulary spread in a language textbook, where very often you'll see images and then the translation in the L2 and no home language present at all. The idea, at least for researchers, being that they're bypassing one part of their memory. They don't have to go through the home language translation. They can just go directly to the schema that they have for the image. So research-wise, you can see why they'd want to do that. It's like a little bit of a shortcut. It's bypassing this other thing. We're getting away from direct translation, that kind of thing. The problem with that is that, so when we transfer that to, let's say there's a screen reader that's trying to read that page. If we don't have that alt text, a screen reader will literally just say image. So we do have to put something in there. And in that case, do we put the L2? We're trying to teach them the L2, right? So in the case of this new vocabulary, it really would have to be in the home language. Otherwise, that student is having different access. It's already a little bit different because it's not image-based, but that person is getting totally different access and maybe no access at all because they might have to go somewhere else to find out what it means in the second language or the foreign language first. So I think in most cases, I would probably suggest that we want to use the home language of the student where that's feasible and if you can do it for a large group of students at once. It might certainly, I understand, get tricky when you have 10 different home languages in the classroom. That gets a little bit harder.
Yeah, thank you. I'll look at the chat again, and please keep adding your questions in the chat or raise your hand. One question here was also, I feel let down by student disability services. They just send accommodation letters but provide no help for instructors. And I personally feel that too. I sometimes get this, and you sometimes get it 2 weeks into the semester because the students don't give it to you right away. And then you're always feeling you're reacting, but you also don't exactly know, and you don't get a lot of information. What can you say? What can we do there? That
is a tough question and a reality that I think a lot of us have to deal with. What I'm about to suggest is by no means a one-size-fits-all sort of silver bullet solution to this. But if we start our course design with some elements of universal design for learning, or even just the general premise of trying to anticipate what we might have in terms of student needs in the class, in terms of accessibility, before we even design the course, it will cut down some on some of those ad hoc accommodations that we have to do in the moment. So if we can start thinking about how might a blind person, let's say you even have a syllabus that you're going to use from last semester, how might a blind person engage in some of the activities that I have? Are there any learning outcomes that might be tricky for students who have X, Y, or Z type of needs? If we do a bit of that proactive brainstorming, even before we know which students and needs we actually have in the class, it can help a lot. That does not mean that we won't have the even last minute feeling sort of ad hoc accommodations to handle, but it can really help. I often give an analogy that I did not come up with. This was a colleague of mine, Liz Huntley, in my program. She's got a great analogy. She talked about preparing for a holiday dinner. And she said, if you just make whatever you want, and then people with food allergies kind of have to pick and choose among the dishes that are available at your house, and then you find out that somebody's got a dairy allergy and you do something about it in the moment, that's an accommodation. But if instead you think, well, probably there's going to be somebody who's vegetarian, so I'll make at least one vegetarian thing. Dairy is a pretty common allergen, so maybe I'll make something without dairy too, at least one of the desserts without dairy or something like that. Taking a little bit more of a proactive approach is one way to help a bit with some of that.
Thank you. Okay, other questions? I think we want to open it up. We do want to.
Let's open it up. Again, our idea here is to have a discussion, and we don't necessarily need to keep Caitlin on the hot seat. We can discuss among ourselves questions or reactions. Please go ahead and raise your hand if you want to speak. I saw a hand. Julie.
Julie has her.
Julie, I saw one too.
So Caitlin, this is related, and Felix, this is related to your comment regarding image tags. And it's not just for homework or studying, but I've also heard that if you put quizzes online and you put the alt tag in the L2, then you're essentially giving the student the answer to the question. So you also have to be aware of where that shows up. And as someone who is not visually impaired, and I don't use a screen reader, I'm not necessarily going to know where that happens.
Mm-hmm. So there's an inequity there too. Yeah, that's a great point.
And Ruth has a question too, or a comment.
Did you see my hand up, Ruth?
Yep.
Yes. Yep.
Go ahead. Ruth.
Oh, okay. So my question is, could you explain a little bit more about that universal course design and where to find information on that?
Yeah, I can give you kind of a really basic overview given the time we have, and then I can give you my go-to resource for it too, which will be easy to find. So universal design for learning comes from a concept that we borrowed from architecture. And I don't really know who we is in this case. I think just educational research in general. The idea behind the architecture version of universal design is, for example, and I always give the same sort of lame example here, but designing a door of a standard width to accommodate as many body types or materials that need to pass through that door as possible. So designing a building or a material for maximum usage. And it speaks again to that very proactive, who do we think is going to be using this space? And how do we need to fit it for maximum use? So that concept of sort of maximizing usage is then applied to educational contexts. And I'm in this case applying it to course design. I think my number one resource for information on universal design for learning is a website, and I'll type it into the chat, but I'll also spell it aloud for you. It's cast.org. That's CAST.org. And again, I'm typing it into the chat for you. That's the one that I go to the most. You'll probably get quite a lot more if you do sort of what I call the 5-minute Google search for additional resources, but that's a very reliable one.
Sorry. I have a comment or question, again, following up on the alt tags and the concept of putting images on our, currently the way we communicate with students is electronically. So we're placing images in email, we're placing images on our web pages, and the concept of trying to stay in the target language, for one thing, runs against what you're recommending in terms of writing in the home language, or describing what the image is. I'm just wondering what others think about that.
I have opinions, but I will hold off and see if anyone else also has opinions on that.
Do you have any thoughts, Dan?
Well, it's something I hadn't really thought about. I think you know, normally one would figure, well, I'm keeping everything in the target language, therefore this is going to be in the target language. But then to consider that actually the task is not to understand this text. The task is to say, here's an image that we're going to use language to talk about.
Yes.
And therefore, you having a sense of what's in this image is valuable so that you understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that the way we need to spin that on its head is try to always think about how is a typically sighted person accessing the information in this image and for what purpose, and then try to get as close to an approximation of that experience for someone who can't access the image visually. And that's why I end up landing on home language, because if we're activating schema, which we often are with images, then that needs to be paramount rather than, like you say, focusing on the language itself. I see that Ruth has another good question about screen readers and languages. It's a great question. I don't know how many they operate in, but many, many. And you can check out, to my knowledge, there are two major, at least, screen reader technologies. One of them is JAWS, and the other one is called NVDA, I think. I might be getting that second acronym wrong. But there are two. JAWS is sort of the older, more researched, I think, more expensive version, and NVDA is this, maybe not totally open access, but it's kind of the one that came later to sort of balance out JAWS. If you Google them, you would be able to find what languages that they're available in. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to quite how many they operate in. That's a great question, though.
Well, I'm keeping my eye on the clock, and we're just about out of time. And I want to thank Caitlin for leading a very interesting discussion today. We will be picking up on this very topic as we go forward. The question about how do you work with the Disabilities Resource Center on your campus, and how does what they do mesh with what we're trying to do in languages? Those are very, very important questions, and we'll be looking at some of those in the weeks to come. I wanted to just point out our next session is going to be next Monday already, and it's going to be coming from the University of Wisconsin. We're excited to, we're very excited to have you here, and we're very excited about having you return and carry on a conversation with us and among our 5 institutions. This is really an exciting opportunity to hear what people outside of our own circles, our own little bubbles, are working on and doing. We're going to be also sending you a survey about this session. Please do complete that and get it back to us. We're learning as we're going along. This is a pilot program, and we're really interested in finding out whether this is a good medium for sharing our resources with one another. Thanks again today to Caitlin and to Felix, and we look forward to seeing you on Monday.